invitadas hoy día en inglés, pero es importante, y quiero decirlo en español antes que empecemos a hablar en inglés, que la idea es que todos podamos ayudarnos. Vamos a tener 3 presentaciones seguidas y al final vamos a tener un espacio de discusión, de preguntas. Todas las charlas van a ser en inglés, pero la idea es que luego el espacio de discusión puedan intervenir independientes si es inglés o español. La idea es que nadie se sienta inhibido por eso y nosotros ayudamos ahí a traducir a inglés ida y vuelta. Yeah? So good evening and welcome to everybody to this seminar with which we are inaugurating this academic year 2022 at the doctoral program in psychology, Universidad Alberto Hurtado. My name is Antonia Larrain and I'm the director of the program. The seminar, entitled Building Families and Identities Through Storytelling, Cross-Cultural Perspectives, has been organized by Javiera Navarro, who is academic at the Universidad Alberto Hurtado and a student at the doctoral program. So thank you very much, Javiera, for this wonderful, or we hope it will be a wonderful event. We are especially grateful to Robyn Fivush and Elaine Reese for joining us today, but also, and most of all, to their willingness to collaborate with Javiera in her work and to engage in intellectual and academic exchange these past years. Robyn and Elaine are 2 women and researchers that have inspired us since a long time ago, I should say. Their work has shown in a very elegant way how language matters for psychological and social development and well-being, and how the form through which we talk to and with others forms and performs the way we feel and the way we think about the world and ourselves. Therefore, language is something that psychology needs to take seriously into account, and that is something that we have tried to do so at the program as well, with the collaboration of international scholars such as Marie-Cécile Barthaud, which is also joining us today in the audience. We have been willing to show how language matters and why it should be studied to understanding personal experiences and psychological unfolding. So we are really honored then to have Robyn and Elaine as speakers today. And let me say a little bit more about them. Robyn Fivush is a Samuel Candler Dobbs Professor of Psychology and Director of the Institute for the Liberal Arts at Emory University. She received her PhD from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York in 1983 and was a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Human Information Processing, the University of California at San Diego from 1982 to 1984. She joined the Emory faculty in 1984, where she is also associated faculty with the Department of Women's Studies and senior fellow in the Center for the Study of Law and Religion. Her research focuses on early memory with an emphasis on the social construction of autobiographical memory and the relations among memory, narrative, identity, trauma, and coping. She has published over 150 books, book chapters, and articles. Elaine Reese is professor at the Department of Psychology at University of Otago. She is the co-leader of Kia Timata Pai, in English to start well. I'm not sure if I spell it right. A national intervention trial with Best Start Early Childhood Centers funded by the Wright Family Foundation. She previously served as the education domain leader on a longitudinal birth cohort study growing up in New Zealand. Elaine has authored over 130 papers and a book for parents entitled Tell Me a Story, Sharing Stories to Enrich Your Child's World from the Oxford University Press. She is a fellow of the Royal Society Tia Parangi and has received grants from the Marsden Fund, the Children's Research Fund of the Ministry of Social Development, and the National Institute of Child Health and Development in the US. She has served as editor of the Journal of Cognition and Development and on the editorial boards of several other journals. Javiera Navarro will also present her work today. Javiera, as I said, is academic at Universidad Alberto Hurtado, where she leads the master program in child clinical psychology at the university. She also is currently doing her doctoral research on donor-conceived families storytelling, and she will be presenting today some of her preliminary results. So the plan is to first hear the talk of Robyn Fivush entitled Family Narratives and Child Outcomes. Then we will invite Elaine Reese to give her talk entitled Reminiscing Interventions Across Cultures. And finally, Javiera will present her talk entitled Reminiscing and Origin Stories with Donor Conception Families in Chile. The talks, as I said in Spanish, will be given in English. And after the 3 presentations of 25 minutes each, I will let you know if you are around those 25 minutes. We will have some minutes for comments and discussions at the end. And at that point, you can join us in Spanish, and we can, as I said in Spanish, translate back and forth. The idea is to have a, you know, I don't know, an interesting time of intellectual collaboration. So thank you again, Elaine, Robyn, Marie-Cécile, also Marcela and Javiera. But thank you everybody for joining us today. And yeah, we hope we will learn a lot together. So please, Robyn, the floor is yours.
Okay, good evening. Can everybody, can you hear me and can you see my screen?
Yes.
And I'm trying to do it. I'm sorry, I don't know quite how to do the slideshow. I don't know how to.
Robyn, if you go onto slideshow and up there and then you.
That's what I'm not, for some reason, I'm not seeing that.
Oh. We can see it. So.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry. Thank you for your patience. And thank you so much for the invitation to allow me the opportunity to tell you about the work that my colleagues, my students, and I have been doing really over the last several decades around family narratives and child outcome. And what I'm hoping to convince you of today is that culture is transmitted in everyday local narrative interactions. Infants are born into storied worlds from the moment of birth. We are hearing stories of ourselves and of other people. Very early in development, we begin to participate in those stories. And through those stories, we learn how to understand who we are, who our family is, and develop a sense of self anchored in a family history. Narratives about the tools and the transmission of culture, in that narratives are the point where the culture and the individual meet. Narratives express not just who we are, who others are, but how the world works, how the world does work, and how it should work. So let me say a little bit about why my focus is on narratives. Narratives are the way in which we make sense of our lived experience. Narratives break up the flow of experience into meaningful chunks, episodes with beginnings, middles, and ends. But even more, narratives move beyond a simple recounting of what happened in the world to include what Brunner has called the landscape of consciousness, what we thought, what we felt, what we think now and feel now. So narratives provide reflection on the event and the experience, interpretation, evaluation. And in this way, narratives really create a sense of self, a sense of narrative identity. How did I become the person I am? Who am I now? And who do I want to be in the future? And this narrative identity is very much formed through a series of commitments and provides a sense of ideals, beliefs, and values for the individual. What I'm going to argue today is that these very, very personal narratives about me, are created through social interactions. That what we consider our most personal sense of being is in fact socially constructed and created. And this is done through both stories of ourselves that we share with others and stories of others that we listen to, hear, and internalize. So I'm going to talk about two very broad categories of research that we've been doing over the last several years. I'm going to talk about how narratives of self are embedded in everyday family interactions during the early preschool years, really the formation of self, and during the adolescent years, the formation of this idea of a narrative identity. And I come at this work from a sociocultural developmental model of autobiographical memory that Catherine Nelson and I developed many years ago. And it's based on the theories of Vygotsky. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with Vygotskyan theory. Vygotsky argued that lives are socially and culturally organized, such that the activities in which we engage are those deemed important by the culture. And that children learn these skills through co-participating in these activities. So probably a really good example of this process is literacy. In Western industrialized cultures, literacy is an important skill that children are expected to master across childhood. But even from the moment of birth, infants are surrounded by the symbols of literacy. There are toys, there are alphabet books, alphabet songs, nursery rhymes, fairy tales. So children, even before they understand what all of these symbols and squiggles might mean, are already being brought into a system where they're beginning to understand that this is something they should pay attention to. It's important. Very quickly, they're brought into participating in these activities, singing the alphabet, reading the alphabet books. And of course, as they progress through formal schooling, forms of literacy become more complex, and their form of participation becomes more complex as well. Well, just as literacy is a valued activity, the cultural value of having and telling a life story is also important, perhaps especially in more industrialized countries where individuals are defined not so much by being of a place and of a time, but by the narrative of who they are. And we see this, again, even very early in development. Children are expected to be able to talk about their personal experiences virtually as soon as they're able to talk. They're asked, tell grandma what we did at the park today. Tell your sister about the birthday party we went to. As soon as they go into any form of formal schooling, they're asked to tell stories to the teacher and other children. What did you do over the weekend? What did you do over the summer? And by middle to late childhood, children are expected to be able to tell something of an autobiographical life story. And we see these expectations mirrored in the kinds of activities we expect of them as they grow into adulthood. Writing a college essay, doing a job interview, meeting a romantic partner. The expectation is that individuals have a coherent story of who they are, that they can express themselves to create these opportunities to become part of the culture. So my early work really focused on the preschool years, how families, parents, particularly mothers, talk with their young preschool children about past experiences, and how these interactions really help children shape their own narrative skills around talking about their personal experiences. So this is just an example of a 4-year-old little girl named Andrea talking with her mother about an incident at school, actually, that happened multiple weeks ago, where another child pinched her. And what we see in this example is that the mother asks a lot of open-ended questions. What did you do? Then what did you do? But at the same time, when the child is not quite responding, she does elaborate and provide some information to help her structure that narrative. Then what did you do? You went and told the teacher. And then what happened? And we also see that Andrea is struggling in many ways to tell a coherent story, but her mother reformulates, reframes, and also in some ways reinterprets these experiences. So Andrea being really focused on how much the pinch hurt her. The mother is, let's not focus on being hurt. You didn't get hurt real bad. right? And she turns it into a narrative of forgiveness, that she did apologize, you accepted her apology. So in this way, we're seeing the mother as both eliciting information, elaborating on information, but also reframing it and reevaluating it and helping her child reframe her emotional experience into a narrative that's not about hurt and anger, but about reconciliation. So there's emotional regulation. There's now been dozens, if not hundreds of studies looking at maternal reminiscing style. And across these studies and in multiple cultures, mothers can really be arrayed along a dimension of elaboration. Some mothers are highly elaborative and emotionally expressive, as Andrea's mother is, asking a lot of open-ended questions, providing information when the child doesn't respond, validating the child's responses, but also helping the child to reframe and reevaluate. And what we see across many, many studies, looking both concurrently and longitudinally at the effects of this more elaborative and emotionally expressive reminiscing style, is that mothers who adopt more of this style have children who, both concurrently and subsequently, show higher levels of theory of mind, the idea that we have minds, I have beliefs, emotions, and desires. You have beliefs, emotions, and desires. They may be the same or different than mine. Perhaps, my favorite ice cream is chocolate and yours is vanilla. Perhaps I was scared, but you found it exhilarating. And that these kinds of internal states differ both across different people, but also across time. More elaborative and emotional expressive reminiscing is also related to higher levels of emotion regulation. And we see this directly related to the extent to which mothers reframe and reevaluate their children's emotions. We see higher self-concept. In particular, mothers who are more elaborative have children who show a more differentiated sense of concept, self-concept, kind of a better understanding of what does describe them and what does not describe them. And they also show more secure attachment. So a sense that security of attachment, that somebody will be there to help you, the world is a safe place, and that you are loved and validated. We were particularly interested in extending this research from preschool into middle childhood and adolescence as children move into expanding worlds, particularly in adolescence, where children are moving into both cognitive worlds that are more complicated and social worlds that are more complicated. So cognitively, as children move into adolescence, they become capable of more complex perspective taking and hypothetical thinking, and they begin to be able to construct more connected and coherent narratives that link multiple episodes into a life story. And socially, adolescents are expected to move into more environments in a way that they have to display autonomous decision-making. So they're no longer necessarily just a child of this family, but they have to start to define who they are, both as part of this family and as separate from this family. So we were really interested in how these kinds of family narratives continue to develop into this period of adolescence. And one of the first ways we did this was to simply tape record family dinner time conversations with families that had a young adolescent child. And we did this to see what kinds of stories or narratives just come up spontaneously around the dinner table. So across all of the dinner table talk, what we did is we looked at who's talking and what are they talking about. And we can basically categorize all of the talk around the dinner table into three buckets of types of talk. There's behavioral regulation, things like, please sit down, please pass the salt. There's general knowledge. This is things like, did you see that they're building a new store on Main Street? Or in this case, a lot of it is around topics that may be discussed at school, like what is electricity, or how do rockets work? And then also narratives, and these are various types of stories that I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail in a moment. But I want to make 2 points about these data first. This shows a number of utterances in a typical family dinner time conversation. And I should stress here, sorry, because we're talking about the role of culture. This study was done in the southern US with broadly middle class, mostly white families. These are utterances made by mothers in the blue, fathers in purple, daughters in this grayer color, and sons in the gold. What you can see is that about a third of all of the conversations is narrative in form. Narratives are very, very frequent in just a typical Tuesday night dinner time conversation and account for about a third of all the talk around a dinner time conversation. And this is actually consistent with a lot of other data that has shown that narratives account for about 35 to 40% of spontaneous conversational interaction. It's also the case that although there's some suggestion that mothers are talking more than fathers or children, there's actually no difference in behavioral regulation in general knowledge. But when it comes to narrative talk, mothers are talking more than fathers or daughters or sons. Mothers are really leading the narrative conversations. So let's take a closer look at these narrative conversations. Again, very broadly speaking, we can divide these kinds of narratives into what has been called in the literature today I narratives. These are narratives where the family comes together at the end of the day and they talk about what they did during the day. Today I had lunch with my friend Sheila. I got an A on my math test. These today I stories were initiated most often by mothers than by fathers or children, although they're not necessarily about mothers. It's the mothers initiating the narrative, usually asking the child about what happened at school that day. About a third of all the stories told around the dinner time table are family stories. Here we do not see a difference in who initiates, and in fact, children are slightly more likely to initiate these family stories than either mothers or fathers. So these are stories about both the shared family past, that's like when we went to the beach last summer, or it can be intergenerational stories. We were kind of surprised at the number of intergenerational stories that were told around a typical family dinner time table. So intergenerational stories are stories about the parents' childhood or the grandparents or aunts or uncles, stories about, well, when I was a child, this is what happened. And what was interesting about this is both that they were told around just an everyday dinner time conversation at all, but that children were just as likely to initiate stories about their parents' childhood as the parents were to initiate stories about their own childhood. This suggested to us that these stories must be of interest and perhaps great importance to these adolescents. So we wanted to explore these kinds of intergenerational narratives in more detail. We began to think about what it is about them that is so powerful. We think they provide a framework from which adolescents can understand their own experiences. They're a model to emulate when constructing a personal identity. And they're a way to explore alternative values within the family. They're also a way to transmit cultural values and for adolescents to both connect to their family, to see how they're the same, but also to individuate from their family. So we followed up this initial study with multiple studies in which we asked adolescents and young adults to tell us stories that they knew about their parents when their parents were growing up. Some studies, we just asked this very general, open-ended question, any story you know. Other studies, we asked about specific kinds of experiences. A time that your mother was proud of something that she did. A time your father was ashamed or felt guilty. A story about your mother or your father that defines who they are as a person. So we've now conducted over half a dozen stories. Let me give you a sense of what a story like this looks like. This is a 14-year-old young male. And there's a couple of things that are interesting about this story that I want to that I want to focus on for you. One is that it's a very coherent, very detailed story. It's a story about his mother standing up to a bully and in fact getting hurt by standing up to a bully who was bullying another child, not the mother. And it's interesting because one, it's very coherent, it's very detailed. There's a lot of specific and elaborate detail in the story. There's also not just what happened, but again, going back to evaluation, interpretation. This child makes his story very real, using quoted speech, talking about his mother's thoughts and feelings. There's also some interesting values being communicated here, like you shouldn't hit girls, but it's important to stand up to bullies. So we see the cultural transmission of life lessons as well as how to be a good person in the world. So again, across multiple studies now, we've looked at adolescents, stories that they tell about their parents when their parents were children. And again, across these studies, although we have much less cross-cultural work on intergenerational narratives, I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Adolescents who tell, again, we see this elaboration and emotionally expressive intergenerational narratives, but also these narratives that include this subjective perspective, what my mother was thinking, what my father was feeling, being inside the parent's head, so to speak. Adolescents who tell stories that are more elaborated and emotionally expressive, and that include more of this subjective perspective, show higher levels of identity exploration. They're interested in learning more about who they are as a person. They show high levels of secure attachment. So we're seeing the continuity of attachment across development. They show higher self-esteem, and they show fewer problem behaviors that are internalizing, anxiety, withdrawal, depression, fewer externalizing, aggression, anger. So it seems that knowing these stories about your parents is really, really good for kids. And I might point out here that this is true over and above the kinds of stories that they tell about themselves. So with Elaine Reese and many other colleagues, we examined possible cultural differences in intergenerational narratives. And we looked at this in New Zealand. And New Zealand was really interesting microcosm to look at this question in, because New Zealand has three fairly distinct populations. And I feel like Elaine, jump in, because if I'm going to misspeak, you need to let me know. But generally, we can think of three cultural groupings within New Zealand. There's the indigenous Maori communities that are have a very strong oral tradition, very strong family ancestry tradition. People are part of large and intricate family trees that they learn about from very early in development. There's also a Chinese community, and again, very, very broadly speaking, Chinese culture tends to be more communal, more relationship oriented, more oriented towards being an integral part of a community, and being very respectful of elders and ancestors. And there is also the European descent community in New Zealand that tends to follow a more Western industrialized, autonomous, urban kind of sense of self. So we were interested in looking at the kinds of intergenerational narratives that would be told by these three different cultural groups. What we found is that across all three cultures, subjective perspective matters in the same way as we had found in our US samples. That is, those adolescents who told intergenerational narratives that included more subjective perspective about their parents, about what their mother was thinking and feeling, what their father was thinking and feeling, showed higher self-esteem. But we also found some cultural differences, in particular with the Maori adolescents. We found that higher thematic coherence in the maternal stories and higher reflection on social relationships in the father stories actually was related to higher levels of depression. So we're not exactly sure how to interpret this, but our preliminary interpretations have to do with issues around being a more oppressed culture, and that counter narratives and reflections on narratives of exclusion might be detrimental for adolescents. So we still have a lot of work to do on understanding cultural aspects of intergenerational narratives. And of course, there's always more to do on cultural aspects of mother-child reminiscing as well. But I hope what I've convinced you of today in this very, very broad overview is that culture is transmitted in everyday local narrative interactions, and that the point where culture and cultural values intersect with narrative is really through family stories, that this is the site of narrative socialization, of self and of identity. With that, I want to thank you. I want to thank all of my amazing collaborators over the years: Marshall Duke, Wadad Zaman, Jenny Bohanna, Kelly Marin, Natalie Merrill, Jordan Booker, Elaine Reese, who has been part of this since the beginning, Chi Wang, Helena Chen, Helena McNally, and always, 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 always a debt of huge gratitude to my mentor, Catherine Nelson. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Robyn. Perfect timing also. So thank you for this wonderful talk. Well, now we invite Elaine to share her presentation, and the floor is yours.
Okay, can everyone see my slides and everything?
Yeah.
So buenas noches, and gracias por invitarme. Javiera, it's just been lovely corresponding with you, and now it's lovely to see you on video. And although it's a shame that you weren't able to make it over to New Zealand as we planned, it's just really nice to have this symposium today and to be able to hear more about your work. So thank you. And also thank you, Robyn. I will never stop learning from you. Every time you give a talk, I learn something new, and you've advanced the field theoretically. So, and in so many ways. So thank you so much. And I should just tell everybody that Robyn has this amazing new chapter coming out soon I know she won't tell you about, but it's in Elements. It's Elements, Cambridge Elements. Is that what it's called, Robyn?
Yeah, Cambridge Elements in Child Development.
Yeah, so it's just a wonderful, just comprehensive view of autobiographical memory narratives and in the field of reminiscing. So watch out for that. So, and also thanks, Robyn, for the wonderful introduction to Reminiscing, which enables me to jump straight into reminiscing interventions. And I want to thank, so kia ora from my PhD students, Sean Marshall, whose data I'm going to be talking about today, and my PhD student, Claire Mitchell, former PhD student, Claire Mitchell, who just completed her PhD late last year. So she's now Dr. Mitchell, and she's now a clinical psychologist in Wellington. And so that's where we are in New Zealand, way down south in Dunedin. And I also have Robyn to thank for being in New Zealand, because she did a sabbatical there while I was a graduate student, and the job offer came up, and I said, what about this job in New Zealand? And she's like, you would love it there. And of course I do. So thank you, Robyn. So what I'm going to be talking about today is I will be focusing on reminiscing interventions, and I'll be telling you specifically about our growing memory study that's been running since the late 1990s. And then I will end really with more questions than answers, asking some questions about cross-cultural extensions, cross-cultural reminiscing interventions, and what's coming and what we should be thinking about perhaps in the future. So just to give you a little background on reminiscing interventions, I wanted to start with just a photo of a mother with a toddler, because that's, as Robyn pointed out, that's when reminiscing starts. From nearly as soon as children begin to talk, they start referring to the past. And parents in many cultures that we have studied so far start extending those references to the past into little mini conversations about the past. So in terms of reminiscing interventions, though, so as Robyn talked about, that she and Catherine Nelson were the first to really discover that there were individual differences in reminiscing styles, and with a focus on mothers. And then so that was in the mid 1980s, mid to late 1980s. By the end of the 1990s, Carol Peterson, as far as I'm aware, she conducted the very first reminiscing intervention with low-income Canadian mothers and their preschoolers to help them develop a more elaborative reminiscing style, although she called it, and she still calls it, a topic extending style, but it is, as far as I can tell, synonymous with elaborative reminiscing, with the practice of asking open-ended, elaborative questions, WH questions, and confirming children's responses. So that's when that one was published. We started the Growing Memory Study before Carol's first intervention had come out. We started it in the 1990s and published the long-term outcomes in 2007. So this was the study that I'll tell you about next. So I'll go into that one in just a bit. And then another very important intervention study is Penny Van Bergen and Karen Salmon and Mark Dadd's study with Australian preschoolers. And that their focus was on specifically on reminiscing about emotions. But again, mainly with, I think there were almost all mothers in that intervention as well. And then there are some very important emotional reminiscing interventions with clinical samples, like Kristen Valentino's sample of maltreating mothers and Karen Salmon's sample of mothers of children with conduct disorders. But to date, as far as I know, all of these reminiscing interventions have been with mothers and with English-speaking samples. But across the board, what they show is that it is fairly easy to teach mothers to be more elaborative in their reminiscing, and that when you do teach mothers those techniques, their children remember more, and they also use more emotion words, and that there are some enduring effects of that more elaborative reminiscing for children. So to go now into more depth on our growing memory study that I referred to earlier, I'm just going to give you, because it has been running now for, well, we just finished the age 21 time point. So it has been running for a number of years. I'm going to go over the early years, this first part, fairly quickly, because that's all been published. But so it was a sample of English-speaking, predominantly New Zealand European mothers and their toddlers, starting at 19 months. And we did collect a baseline reminiscing sample, and also assess children's vocabulary at that point, and then randomly match the mothers on elaborations, and then randomly assign them to either an intervention group or a control group. And then I'll tell you more about the actual intervention in just a bit, but that intervention phase lasted for the next year, from when children were 1.5 to 2.5. And then there was a long-term post-test when they were 3.5, and an early adolescent post-test at age 11. Just a little backstory here. Some of you may know that I left New Zealand to go back to the States and take a job at Clark University, and I thought that was the end of the study. But then I had the chance to return to New Zealand, and I thought, oh, I wonder if I could start back up the longitudinal study. And so you can see that we didn't have quite as many at that age 11 time point, but we did manage to get over half of them back. And then what I'm going to be talking about mostly today is the age 15 and the age 21 time points, where we did manage to recover. We almost got back up to the age 3.5 numbers with 94 at this age 21 time point. And I have to say a huge thank you to my students for doing the hard work. At that age 21 time point, they were going around actually knocking on doors, inviting the 21-year-olds to be in the study, and sort of the hard to reach ones, and sometimes, interrupting their video gaming in their pajamas and asking them to be in the study. But they did a great job at getting them interested in participating again. So what was the intervention? What did we do when they were toddlers? It's a light touch intervention. So for those mothers who were in the intervention group, from at 21 months, 25 months, 29-month time points, we were visiting all the families in their homes every 2 months. But at those 3 time points, we encouraged the mothers in the intervention group to have, to use these techniques to have additional reminiscing conversations with their children. And the way we framed it to them was that we had framed it as a study of language and memory. And we said, this is another way, to help your child's language and memory development. And it'll be easier to have these reminiscing conversations if you use these techniques. It will actually be more successful, and it will be more fun, and your child will be more interested in in sharing the memories. And we knew that from the previous research that I did with Robyn for my PhD, that when mothers use an elaborative style, children are less off topic. And so that's basically just instructing them to use more of those WH questions, not to talk about repeated events, to focus in on these distinctive events, but ones that were interesting to their child. And a lot of it was really about responding sensitively to their children. And I think that's very important in terms of the results that we got by, that I'll tell you about in a minute, praising their children's responses, following in, and if they don't respond, being elaborative instead of just repeating the same question, and just keeping it really fun. And we had a little certificate that said, I talked about the past lots with my mom. And they had these little stickers that they could, a little stamp that every time they had a conversation, they could stamp their certificate. And so that's really what we did over that year. We asked mothers to tape record those conversations on these huge, remember those old cassette recorders? And we were going to transcribe and analyze all of these. Well, I can tell you that just the sound quality was terrible, but they did it. So I think that was also part of the what attributed to the success of the intervention, is that it was a reminder to them to have more of these conversations. So I'll go over these findings very briefly because they have been published, but basically the intervention worked. The mothers in the coaching group were more elaborate, asked more open-ended elaborative questions. They were more confirming, and they were still using that elaborative style compared to mothers in the control group, even a year after the intervention had ended. So in those post-test reminiscing conversations that we asked all mothers to do, it was just talk as you normally would with your child about the past. We didn't give either of the groups any tips on how to do it. Correspondingly, the children remembered more with their mothers at both of those ages. And this is important, at age 3.5, when we collected researcher child conversations, they told more detailed narratives to a researcher, specifically using more actions. And there were some other effects that it was especially strong for children who started out the study with higher levels of self-awareness. The children who started out the study with lower language levels, however, benefited more from their mothers being in the intervention group. So they had better theory of mind skills at age 3.5. So those are the early childhood findings. At age 11, we were so surprised to find when we asked the mothers and children to do another reminiscing conversation, this time about a positive event and a negative event, that those mothers they were still more elaborative than the mothers in the control group. And their young adolescents were more elaborative in those same conversations, and they were expressing more of their negative emotions. And I think that's important too, because it indicates that they were comfortable expressing negative emotions with their mothers. And with researchers, those adolescents who had been whose mothers had received the intervention, they told more coherent, structurally coherent narratives about a low point in their life. There was no difference between the two groups in how they told a high point narrative. So it seems to be specific to the way they were talking about difficult events in their lives. So before I get to the adolescent time points, and I can go over this quickly because Robyn's done such a wonderful introduction on overview of narrative identity. But the 3 dimensions of narrative identity that are looking important in this recent paper by Kate McLean, Robyn, and many other researchers, it looks like there are these 3 dimensions that are important. There's autobiographical reasoning, how adolescents and adults are linking the past to who they are. And that is clearly, in many studies, positively linked to well-being, in adults at least. A second dimension is how well-formed the story is, particularly, does it have a clear beginning, middle, end that's resolved? And I see I've got the wrong date on that publication. It's 2011, not 2001. Structural coherence is not as strongly associated with well-being, but it is in some studies. And as Robyn just pointed out, for the Maori adolescents telling their parents' life stories, thematic coherence is sometimes negatively associated with well-being. But the motivational affective dimension of how much agency is expressed in the narrative and talking about other people, that dimension is more clearly and strongly linked to well-being across many studies, at least with adults. But we're still trying to figure out for adolescents, these links with well-being aren't as clear. So our hypotheses for the age 15 and age 21 time points on growing memories, we first predicted that being in the intervention group would result in stronger narrative identity for the adolescents and young adults compared to if their mothers were in the control group. And we also predicted that being in that intervention group would predict better well-being, but we thought that that might not be a direct effect. It might be mediated through any changes in their narrative identity, because the study was designed as an autobiographical memory and narrative intervention, not as a well-being intervention. So at those age 15 and age 21 time points, we did manage to contact all of those original 115 participants who'd made it through the intervention, and managed to recruit 93 at age 15, 94 at age 21. And many of those participants came into the lab, most of them did, but at age 21, we were collecting data, during the pandemic. And so we did do a number of Skype and Zoom interviews, but they weren't any different from when we brought the young adults into the lab. So the main live story task was to ask them about a turning point event, a time that they now saw as a turning point and what their life was like, or what they were like as a person. We did do a whole life story interview, but this turning point narrative is proving to be one of the most interesting aspects of the life story and the most fruitful in terms of the results. So focusing on that one today. We coded them for causal coherence, which is a measure of autobiographical reasoning, linking the past event to who they are now, and also for thematic coherence, how well formed is the story. At age 21, we actually dropped, we haven't done the thematic coherence coding yet, because it is at age 15, it wasn't looking as important, but we may still do that, where the causal coherence was returning better results. So we focused on causal coherence, and we wanted to add something from that motivational affective dimension. So we've also coded for agency and communion. In terms of well-being, we had questionnaire measures at both of those time points, measuring depression, anxiety, stress, but also positive well-being, life satisfaction, and self-esteem. We also wanted to control for their personality traits. So John Adler and a number of narrative identity theorists have talked about the unique importance of narrative identity for well-being over and above personality traits. And of course, that links back to Dan McAdams' layers theory of personality, saying that personality traits are a layer, these are ways that we're like a lot of other people, but narrative identity is in that top layer, and that every person's narrative identity is unique. And when we're trying to see if narrative identity is linked to well-being, we really need to control for personality traits because they're so strongly correlated with well-being, and we want to assess the unique contribution of narrative identity. So we did use mediation models to test these hypotheses, to test both the effect of the elaborative reminiscing intervention on all of those narrative dimensions, the direct effect on well-being, but also to test whether narrative identity mediated well-being, controlling for all the baseline measures for age at interview and personality traits. The results were very similar at age 15 and age 21. The main finding is that being in that elaborative reminiscing intervention meant that adolescents and young adults had higher causal coherence, so that's greater autobiographical reasoning, when they were 15 and 21. Being in the reminiscing intervention also meant that they had better well-being. So at age 15, that was measured with the emotional problems subscale of the strengths and difficulties questionnaire. And so that means they had lower levels of depression and anxiety. At age 21, again, they were less depressed and also had higher self-esteem. But what we didn't find any mediation of those effects on well-being via their narrative identity. All of those well-being effects were direct effects. Okay. So here's an example of a narrative that was high in causal coherence. So in Dunedin, there are a number of single-sex schools, and now I can't remember, I think in Santiago, you also have single-sex schools. And so it's similar to that. And, they wear uniforms and so it's quite similar. So this young woman, this is from age 15, and she's just talking about how that choice to go to an all-girls school did affect who she was, that she just felt like she could be herself and not having to be who someone else wanted me to be. So we rated this one as high in causal coherence. So as far as we know, this is the first study to demonstrate these really long-term effects of maternal elaborative reminiscing on both autobiographical reasoning and well-being in adolescence. The age 15 findings just came out last month in Journal of Personality, and the age 21 findings are being reviewed right now. We're still, I think the effect on causal coherence is fairly straightforward to interpret, given that elaborative reminiscing is all about understanding links, associations within the memory and across memories and links between past and present and future. So that one's pretty understandable. The effects on well-being are harder to interpret in our study because unfortunately we didn't have measures of emotion regulation, emotion understanding throughout. And now I wish that we did, because I think that could be why those well-being effects are happening and why they're not necessarily being mediated through narrative identity. That they could, we know that reminiscing is helpful for children's emotion understanding from other studies. And I think it could be that mechanism that's helping with the lower levels of depression and anxiety that we're seeing in adolescents. Of course, one limitation is that our intervention was only with mothers. At the time in New Zealand in the late 1990s, almost all primary caregivers were mothers. There were very few fathers who were primary caregivers. So it would be really interesting to do this same study now with primary caregiver fathers to see if we could get the same results. So it won't be research that I conduct, but I hope that somebody will do that research. And of course, it's restricted to a primarily European sample. So one big question is, would we see these same benefits if we did a reminiscing intervention in a non-European, non-English speaking culture? So that's where I would like to leave things is, what do we need to know? What do we need to think about if we're going to consider doing reminiscing interventions across cultures? The ideal scenario would be that we have this wonderful detailed longitudinal information about reminiscing style within the culture before we start the intervention for all the major caregivers these days, mothers, fathers, grandparents, teachers, early childhood teachers. So Robyn and Catherine Nelson did that work, and then Robyn's students over the years, we've all done that work in European English-speaking cultures. So we knew longitudinally what was associated with positive things for children. But we're really only beginning to do that in non-European descent, non-English speaking cultures. So far, there are some really promising results. Another former PhD student, Tia Neha, has done some work with Maori mothers, and when they reminisce more elaboratively, and let me tell you, they can be very elaborative, especially about certain events that are very significant to the family or to the culture, that elaborative reminiscing is linked to children's memory, positively linked to children's memory. Chi Wang's research with Chinese and Chinese American parents is really interesting because even though they are less elaborative in certain ways, when they are more elaborative, their children supply more memory information. But it's a complicated effect. So elaborative reminiscing about children's personal experiences may not always be a good thing in some cultures, especially in cultures that are more interdependently oriented. Some really interesting studies that are just coming out, intervention studies with early childhood teachers in non-English speaking cultures. For instance, Lisa Schroeder's intervention with teachers in German preschools. So the teachers are German, but and most of the children are in the preschools are not from German culture. So they're from a diverse range of cultures and languages. And what they did in their, they did it was essentially a reminiscing intervention. They call it decontextualized talk, but it's elaborative talk about past and future. And what they did to make it more culturally appropriate for the children was to include more social content. Instead of being so child-directed about the child's experiences, they were, the teachers learned to talk about other people's experiences. And they are getting promising results, particularly for children's language development. And Juliana Meltzy has just published another study with early childhood teachers in an oral storytelling intervention that is very similar to elaborative reminiscing. And then finally, in our new study that the English version, we just call it Best Start, because it's with an early childhood service called Best Start. We are, I've designed a new intervention called Enrich, Enhancing Rich Interactions, that incorporates elaborative reminiscing, but also elaborative talk across many other contexts, like book reading, elaborative talk during nappy change times, elaborative talk during playtime, meal time. So it's across the day. And it is with a diverse sample of toddlers. So we are hoping to, who knows, maybe the next time, if we're able to have a symposium in Chile someday, I'll be able to tell you about the results of that study. So it is always a story. When you do longitudinal research, it's always to be continued. So muchas gracias, everyone. Thank you for having me, Javiera, and thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thank you very much, Elaine, for such a brilliant talk and amazing results. And yes, it would be wonderful to have you both here in Chile soon. Well, now it's your turn, Javiera, so please go ahead.
Okay, so well, I cannot start without saying that how deeply grateful I am for Robyn, Fivush, and Elaine Reese to be here today. This is an amazing honor. Thank you so much. You've been inspirational on my work. Be very relevant. Leading woman in the world of developmental psychology, family narrative, storytelling, autobiographical memories, and autobiographical self. And your generosity with me has been amazing. I wrote to you emails. You had no idea who I was. I was coming from the end of the world. PhD student from a university. You had no idea what it was. And from the down south, well, and you both accepted immediately. You were willing to read what I was trying to think using your ideas, and both of you immediately were willing to accept me to go and spend 3 months with you in your universities. It was quite risky, so I cannot but say thank you so much. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately for you, COVID-19 saved you from that happening. But it was really very, very generous of you. And today you are here. We've been planning this for a long time, but finally this is happening. Well, this is the elaborative reminiscing that I have done of your ideas. So let's see if it makes any sense to you of the way I've read your work. So the concept of family has been subject in the last 50 decades of enormous transformations. And despite the fact that alternative family forms have existed throughout the Western culture for a long time, they also have been the focus of significant stigma. Artificial reproductive technologies inaugurate what Susan Gollenbach calls new family forms that include homosexual couples, single parents by choice, and heterosexual families with fertility problems, all using donated gametes, eggs, sperms, or embryos. Donors are usually unknown to recipients, respecting a logic that is generalized in medicine, which is confidentiality. Nevertheless, because in reproduction, there exist particular conflicting interests, that of the child, the parent, and the donor, secrets and anonymity become problematic. This is where narratives of origins are relevant or become relevant. Children in these families need to have the possibility throughout their development to discuss and negotiate their stories of origin within their familiar context, to build their identities. And it is important that they position themselves regarding some traditional positions, which play a relevant role in our society, which tends to be quite traditional. In my research, I have used a totally different literature, that of the outside of the artificial technology world or the donor conception world, which is the one that we have just heard today with Robyn, Fivush, and Elaine Reese. Coming from developmental psychology to think about conception stories. An increasing number of naturalistic studies have addressed the relationship between mother and child communication and the development of autobiographical memories through storytelling. This is the work of Catherine Nelson, Robyn Fivush, and Elaine Reese with their teams. Reminiscing, sorry, I always say reminiscing because it was a word I don't know, and I know it's reminiscing, but I tend to say reminiscing. Reminiscing is a dialogical way of talking about the past that becomes critical for children's learning in terms of narrating their own personal experiences. And research is quite consistent to show that maternal reminiscing, including birth stories, has an impact on diverse children outcomes. Literacy skills, memory skills, narrative skills, understanding the minds of others, emotional regulation, and especially relevant for my study is the link to identity work, sense of self, and autobiographical memories. But as Robyn Fivush says, it is not narrative structure per se that influences outcomes, but narrative reasoning. And therefore, we need to consider integration and differentiation across different narrative types to best understand this developmental process. So, when these parent-child conversations include negotiation, resolving differences, accepting different perspectives, and regulating difficult emotions, they are described as elaborative storytelling. So what I thought it was a gap on what we knew coming from donor-conceived families was that if we put together these two worlds, we could conclude that we know quite little about how parents discuss conception stories with their donor-conceived children and how children make sense of these stories. This is an increasing, there is an increasing tendency to disclose origins, But how the process is achieved remains unclear. What we do know is that parents approach the issue with concern, which might result in low elaborative storytelling. So the question, this is not the whole, there's two questions that I approach in my PhD, but this is the one that I will elaborate, that I will focus in today, a bit of it, because this in 20 minutes I cannot focus on everything. But the first question was to think about how do families with donor conceived children talk about their origins with them? And we divided it in three parts: through which styles of talking this origin storytelling unfold in families with donor conceived children. The second part, which is the one that I will be looking most into today: do families with donor conceived children talk through elaborative reminiscing, and to what extent? That we had no idea if there was some kind of elaborative reminiscing happening, and if there was any difference in storytelling practices regarding the diverse donor-conceived family types. If we would find differences in heterosexual, homosexual, single mothers, egg, sperm, or embryo donation. And for that, we wanted to look into the naturalistic conversations, how, just as Robyn described, the typical conversation that happened between families, but regarding the specific issue of origin. And we built three kinds of analysis. One is the elaborative analysis that is based on the work of Dr. Fivush and Dr. Reese, or our interpretation of that work. So, the research methodology, we were able to recruit 17 donor conception families with children between 3 to 11 years old. We excluded any families that were doubtful if they wanted to disclose or not disclose. So all families were sure that they wanted to disclose the fact that there was a donor in the family conception. I had a privileged access to this, to families, especially to single mothers by choice, as I am myself a single mother by choice that used sperm donor to conceive my child. It was a qualitative study, although what you'll see today is a bit more quantitative, but still qualitative, under a qualitative study, more descriptive, naturalistic. It had three parts. Where first we asked the families to have the conversation of origins with their children. Later, we asked the families the parents to have a small interview with the child or with the children. Sometimes there were twins or twins, about the experience of having that conversation. And afterwards, I had an interview with the parents and the analysis later on. So how did we define, and this is based on Elaine's work, how did we define naturalistic conversation? The researcher asked the parents to share the conversation and storytelling of origins with their children and to audio or videotape these dialogues at least one time. The families could choose how they felt more comfortable. The idea was that it was as natural as possible. So they could audio videotape depending on how they felt more comfortable. Families were free to repeat the conversation if they desire. If the conversation had been too brief or if it naturally evolved into a second part. The researcher was not present during the event, so therefore for it to be as natural as possible. And the parents receive a letter with some brief indications of how to do it. They could, the letter was basically telling the parents to do it as natural as possible, as they would always do it. If so, any kind of decisions, they would say, do it as you would decide to do it. No, can I invite somebody to be present? If you would naturally do it, invite somebody. Can I do it at bedtime? If you usually do it at bedtime, do it. If can I audio tape it instead of videotape it? If that is how you do it, do it. No, we really invited families to do it as how they. And so this is a little finally the group of families. We ended up having well, of the 17 families, 5 were heteroparental families, 6 were homoparental families, all females. I could not include male homoparentals because in Chile, ¿cómo se dice sustitución? Surrogacy. Surrogacy, it's not legal here, so I would have a lot of problems with the ethical committees. So it was only female homoparental and 6 families of female monoparental. So that was so it was quite even. What was probably interesting is that by far the most difficult group to have access to were heteroparental families. So I had 9 rejections from them, 9 families that I approached them, that usually mothers would say, yes, okay, I'm really interested. And then they went with dad to ask, and dad said, no, we will not discuss, we're not doing that. So, and those were and with the heteroparental families, those are I got the idea that the truth bearers in families are mothers, no? The ones that talk about the family history, is mom. So finally, well, obviously there's more women involved because there's a lot of more female participation, but even in the heteroparental families, there are 3 fathers that decide not to participate. I have 20 children participating, the average age being 4 years and 4.8 is the average age. 24 mothers involved and only 4 fathers involved. So finally what we'll see will be mothers with children, because I have to do a different analysis to understand what is happening with the dads. And the type of donations, there are 11 sperm donations, 3 ovo donation, and 3 double donations. And well, challenges to participation is basically, I think, 2 kinds of resistance. One, big resistance from males in heteroparental families, that many of them openly say, well, why do we have to tell this story? It doesn't make any sense. It's just going to be, like open up wounds that there's no sense opening. And the other thing is that people would say to me, yes, obviously we will do it this weekend, happily to do it. And they would take a lot of time of doing it. So I think there's like a willingness to participate, but then when you actually have to do it, then you have to have the talk. It's not that easy as you think it's going to be, no? So that's, so saying yes and then saying no, that's, so how did we go analyzing the conversations? How are we doing it? Because we're still in the procedure. So first we call the first kind of analysis we call the structural pragmatic analysis, where we want to see how the exchanges, or at the moment we are understanding exchanges or utterances or terms in a bit of a similar definition. So for us, is an exchange or a turn or an utterance is the same thing, which I know this is a very complicated issue when you're studying language. So, but this is our definition at the moment. So we want to see how the turns are negotiated, who speaks more, who speaks longer, who and who takes the turn and who initiates a turn, and all of that is called structural pragmatic analysis. And what is happening in the turn in terms of the content is the pragmatic analysis, is the bit of not the structure but the pragmatic, and we divide the statement or the exchange into 4 categories: factual, elaborative, narrative, or narrative elaborative. When we say factual, it refers to statements that describe facts, events, actions that do not seek to expand fields of meaning. They're rather close possibilities. So it's when you are asking for a specific piece of information, and this is Elaine describes this very well when you're talking about low reminiscing styles. No, when you just, it seems to be looking for when a mom asks, well, what is your favorite color, and the child wants to talk about something else, but the mother insists, and there's like you're looking for a specific piece of information. No, so that would be something that's quite factual. When the child would say no, yes, or that's like you're closing the possibility of a conversation to happen. We call that factual. Or we use factual for that. It's not us, we're basing in your descriptions. Elaborative, it's on the contrary, refers to statements or utterances that describe, clarify, broaden, or connect meanings, give or ask for justification or explanation, either of facts or positions regarding events, emotions that allow to expand fields of meaning. So new possible questions emerge, elaborations allow reflections, reasoning, and negotiations. And we have also the narratives, that are statements that constitute a plot, that connect events temporarily in an articulated way. They're the building of a story. They can be long statements, but we also would consider narrative something that is maybe a fragment or a bit of the story. Because we're asking the parents, we were asking the families to tell the story of origin. So a lot of the statements will be bits of a story. And when we would find sometimes that some of the exchanges would be narratives, but would also have elaborative elements. So those we would classify as narrative elaborative. With all the changes that we coded as elaborative and a narrative elaborative, we would then do the reminiscing or the elaborative analysis. So we would then go into our second analysis, that is the elaborative analysis, and we would analyze the type of reminiscing markers. And then this is something we build, but is totally based on the reminiscing markers that Dr. Fivush and Dr. Reese have developed. We organize them, and this is something that I really want to hear your thoughts. We organize them in a bit of a different way, and we build this categories of reminiscing markers, which has elaborative questions, markers about descriptions and connections, narrative reasoning, and interactive negotiations. So when, and this is relevant because a statement can actually have more than one reminiscing marker. If I say, why did you feel sad yesterday? You could say that's a why question. It's a past question, and it's also a question about emotion. So it has 3 different reminiscing markers. We usually find that statements they never have more than 3 reminiscing markers. But what it's been useful to distinguish is that not all markers are the same, and we tend, at least with our sample, to see that families or have a lot of elaborative questions and have a lot of descriptions and connections, but it's harder to find. Although there are many possibilities in terms of narrative reasoning, it's much more difficult to find narrative reasoning. One alternative might be because the children we were looking into are quite little, and that's something also quite interesting, because the children we were working with are really a first new generation of donor conceived children in Chile. It was very difficult for me. First, we decided that we were going to work with children from 4 onwards, and it was very difficult for me to find children older. For the lesbian couples, it was almost impossible to find women that had children older than 4 years old, because the boom of lesbian mothers in Chile was 3 years ago. So might be that the narrative reasoning is because it's more complex to do, to dispute, dispute. It's very hard to find, for example, in the or it might also be that to dispute or create a narrative tension is something that families might tend to avoid. You might want to work in terms of positive feelings.
Javi, yo creo que para que dejemos un tiempo para la discusión, yo creo que sí, son las 8:05.
Okay, the families. So the families, just to give you a little bit of a flavor, the families that participated already in terms of how they told the stories. So here is how they participated. Usually 7 families, both parents participated in the storytelling process. In 4, only 1 parent participated, and in 6 families, it does not apply because they're single parents. If we think about the structure, do we want to see some kind of differences in terms of the structure? I think the only thing we can see maybe interesting is that in the heterosexual children are much older, which is quite interesting because it's the children that less know about the origins, so they're older and they know less. This is how we see it here. 3 families that it was the first time that they were being told that they were donor conceived. So they're older and they have not been told, which is, in a way, it's sort of, you can understand, because they have no reason to know, because their family structure sort of simulates perfectly well any traditional family form. No, if you're in a lesbian family or you're in a single mother family, of course you're soon going to look around and you're going to say, well, my family is a bit different. So it's easy to avoid the conversation. So we were saying that 4.8 is the average, and here it's much older. Going to try to go. So in terms of the naturalistic conversation, most of the family does 1 time the conversation, but 6 families do it twice. They do 2 audio tapes, and 3 families do 3 times. First time they tell the family for the research, only 4 families do it for the first time, which is still quite well. I think this is a gift, no? That for me or for the research, they do this for the first time. So I have audio tape that moment that for the first time a child is taught about their origin. How many families they use books, and does that make any difference? So 29% of the families they use a book to tell. So in total we have 30 naturalistic conversation. In average they last 66 minutes and 46 seconds. They usually do it at bedtime, and it's usually an intimate event. Nobody else participates. It's usually the child and the parents. Sometimes there are even brothers that are not donor conceived. They not even them participate. Nobody else in the family participates. Even many times the other people in the family, grandparents, are not even aware that the children are donor conceived. Especially that happens in heterosexual families. So in terms of the structures of the conversations, the number of turns is usually 50. So that's when the amount of turns that usually happens in 6.5 minutes, more or less. The initiation of the turns are usually more around parents, although children do initiate turns as well. So it's quite interesting, thinking that children are quite little. Children react more than parents. And well, parents do more something that we call reaction initiation, not that you react, but as well you then initiate something. And in terms of the elaborativeness of the utterances, children are quite as elaborative as parents, which we think is very interesting. That they're almost as they're much more factual, which we thought that was going to happen, of course, but they're all almost the same in terms of elaborative. And of course, parents are more narrative. Well, that was quite expected. In the turns, mothers say 17 words and children say 5. And although it is about telling a story, what is done most is provide factual information. And in terms of elaborative reminiscing, well, we see, as I just told you, that are quite both children and parents are, children and mothers are very elaborative, but children are much less narrative. And here I separated the different types of markers in terms of reminiscing, and you can see, maybe I won't go into details of each, but you can see that in terms of elaborative questions, we can see a lot of elaborative questions done by parents and by children. Questions of descriptions and connections, you can also see a lot, but then when it goes to narrative reasoning, that becomes a little more scarce, except giving a specific explanation. So, and that it makes sense because there's a lot of questions, so parents and children do give explanations, no? But giving evaluative feedback is not very, very high, or creating narrative tension, disputing is not very high as well. And interactive negotiation also doesn't happen a lot. That's how you see, just have to have a vision of what happens on some of all. And just wanted to give you an idea of 3 specific families, 2 high elaborative families. This is a little girl, a homoparental family with a little girl that's 4 years old that says, look, she says, look, what happens is that the heart gets with the tummy, and there the tummy begins to grow and grow and grow, and the stúcula means that the heart is there and the baby appears. So this is a little girl that she takes hold of the narrative, no? So here she assumes, and we can see this gets, there's quite high, and child assumes the lead role of the narration, no? She's very special in that she is high in reminiscing, in elaborative, but the kind of, when you go and see the specific kind of elaborative markers, or the reminiscing markers, this is one that she has quite high, which is very rare. So it's I would say it's a high quality reminiscing marker, no? So she's high in interactive negotiation, high in narrative reasoning, not very high in disputing though, and high in elaborative question. On the other side, this is a little girl that is also quite high. This daughter is in orange, quite high in elaborative, but she is, her high is the why question. So she's also 4. Sorry, I didn't put the H here. She's also 4-year-old, but what she's doing is doing all the time the why question. So we wanted so much, mom says, we wanted so much to see you. Why? Because we always saw you only in X-rays. Why always? And we look a lot at you. Why a lot? So she's insisting on the why, but she's not elaborating very much, like what is happening. No, she's like the typical toddler that is doing the why, but not elaborating very much, no? So maybe the reminiscing there is not very much of a high quality. ¿Ya estoy, Anto?
Sí, o sea, hace rato.
Hace rato, okay. So I think apparently I'm very past my time. So this is, maybe you can ask me later. This is a conversation where there's absolutely no reminiscing marker from the child. Of the two children, there's two children. There's twins, and nothing appears from. And the mother goes, "You do not resemble me because you don't have my seed. You do remember that, right?" And children say, "Right." And this goes on, no? And so you understand that you do not have migraine, right? And the children respond, "Right." No, so the children are always responding factually, and actually, there's actually absolutely no elaborative markers from them. So, okay, I'll so maybe just read the conclusions. We have good reasons to say that donor-conceived families do talk through elaborative reminiscing, but we still need to study the data to better understand how interactive and co-constructive are the stories they build, and if the elaborations are questions and information given, or actually possibilities to negotiate, dispute, reason, and work difficult emotions. And we also need to balance between generalities of what we understand and the uniqueness of each family that needs to emerge beyond the family types and make more sense. And it makes more sense probably to think about typologies and not maybe, we probably won't find sustainable things to say that there are big difference between homoparental, heterosexuals, or monoparental, no? But we need to let the diversity to emerge to be able at the end to give specific answers to, because what really makes sense to me is that reminiscing is something that can be taught. And then we have a tool that can make the life of donor-conceived families better. And well, I guess that is what moves me and what moves this research. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Javiera, very much. Gracias, Javiera. Well, we now have a couple of minutes for comments, questions, discussions. The floor is open for everybody. You can do questions for Robyn and Elaine and Javiera, but also Robyn and Elaine, you can, and Javiera, you can also comment or question each other. Entonces ahora no sé si hay preguntas, comentarios a los trabajos presentados, pueden hacerlo por el chat o pueden levantar la mano. Carolina.
Hi, good evening. I was very interested by the three talks. I wanted to ask Robyn about her talk. When you described this dinner talk, and you said that the child was being inside the parent's head in this conversation, immediately I thought of the concept of reflective functioning and mentalization. And I wondered how you relate that to your approach for this.
Thank you. Yes, I think that it's a great question. I think it is a related concept. And I also think that's why we're seeing the relations to attachment security, both in the preschoolers and the adolescents, because I think what's going on in these reminiscing conversations and in the intergenerational narratives with this perspective taking the subjective perspective is understanding the world from multiple perspectives and creating a sense of where you belong in that space. What we see in the preschool years is that it's the mothers who are driving, well, could be the fathers as well. We have too little data on father reminiscing because, as Javiera noted, fathers don't like to participate. So when we try and include fathers, we don't get as much, we don't get as many people agreeing to participate. But in the preschool years, when mothers are doing mentalizing in terms of talking about their own internal states, but also helping the child understand the child's internal states, we're seeing those connections to emotional regulation, coping, and attachment. And I think what we don't know, and it's a great question, the extent to which it's those kids who then, when they're telling stories about their parents, are more likely to engage in subjective perspective taking.
Thank you. Yeah. And in the same line, I was also thinking about what's called intergenerational transmission of trauma, for example, when there's reminiscing of our own stories to the kids and how that is told. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I have a lot of thoughts about that. I've thought about that a lot. We work with mostly functional families, and most of them do not choose to talk about highly traumatic experiences. When we ask families to talk about challenging or stressful experiences, they choose, for the most part, to talk about things like the death of a grandparent, the death of a pet. But as Elaine pointed out, and we see again and again across different kinds of reminiscing studies, discussion of negative emotion and challenging events is driving a lot of this. A lot of the effects. It matters more how families talk about negative experiences, even if they're minor negative experiences, like getting pinched by your friend. But I don't think we have a lot of data on how families actually talk about traumatic experiences with young children. More of that data comes out of research with adult children and parents. I don't know. I think, and actually one of the questions I have for Javiera is, what is developmentally appropriate to talk about? I mean, in terms of what a 4-year-old can even understand about conception. So how does that play into how, what, and when you talk about certain things?
Thank you.
Javiera, do you want?
Yeah. I don't know should we translate a bit or that's okay? Antonia, no?
Go ahead.
Translate? No, no sé si los demás entendieron, pero la Carolina preguntó sobre cómo lo que estaban hablando tenía que ver con la idea de reminiscing, que también y Robyn dice que sí, que efectivamente hay mucha conexión con la idea, y se pusieron a conversar sobre cómo el trauma y cómo el reminiscing encaja con las ideas de cómo se conversa sobre trauma, y que no hay mucha investigación de cómo se conversa sobre trauma, y lo que hay es con familias con niños más grandes, no con niños tan chicos. Y de ahí surge la pregunta que Robyn me hace a mí ahora sobre, bueno, ¿qué es lo que es apropiado para conversar con niños más chicos? Si efectivamente las historias, cuán apropiado es hablar efectivamente, en términos del desarrollo, cuán apropiado es hablar y en qué minuto hablar de qué y cómo sobre los orígenes. And that's thank you, Robyn, for the question, because that's actually was a challenge for our research, and that was one of the reasons why. Well, there was 2 reasons why we wanted children to be at least 4. One was because we wanted for them to have good language capacities, and the other was because it was relevant that they could negotiate the conversation and have a theory of mind, have different developmental acquisitions, to be able to have a complex conversation, and because children were smaller, it was 4 onwards, so we were thinking children 5, 6, 7, and one of the reasons that the conversation of that there's zero reminiscing in the children calls my attention is because actually those are children that are 8 years old. So I would have expected a little bit of more reminiscing there or elaborativeness there because they were older, and there was none. I think there's coming from the donor conception world, there is not much, but a little bit of evidence gathered or experience gathered, I would say, that of how you talk to children, how you simplified the words and how you speak to them. So I think mothers already have acquired a way of speaking that is age appropriate. But of course, it's difficult sometimes to challenge children a bit more. And we were proposing in the interview, we proposed questions to them, for them to do some questions to the children. And a lot of the times those questions did not work because they require certain, what did you like about your story? What's your favorite part? And those were too difficult for when the child was 3, it was impossible for them to answer them. On the other hand, there is amazing elaborativeness in children age 4. So you can see, I mean, there's 2 little girls of 4 that they can be so reminiscing, no? So that's a question to me, no? How can some children at 4 be so elaborative? Is it just a question about age, or is it all a question about how those parents have spoken to them from very early on?
Thank you, Javiera. Elaine?
Yes, I have a question for Javiera, and also just it's so wonderful to see your beautiful data and just the results that you're finding. It's such a fascinating project, and I'm sure that Robyn agrees. When you first wrote to us, it's just such a novel question and a novel data set that you've collected beautifully. So, yeah, well done. So my main question is, are you planning to follow up these families longitudinally to see how the conversations change as the children get older? I know that's a horrible question to ask when you've just finished all the data collection.
Well, I think we have a little bit of a commitment, or it's like a moral debt. I don't know if it's a moral debt, but this is the first generation of donor conceived children in Chile, so I think it would be really irresponsible not to follow them. You know, it's we need, in terms of we have a unique opportunity to see how these children develop, and so I know with longitudinal studies in Chile, I was telling to you in some of the conversations we have, please show your longitudinal data, because that's always so interesting for us in Chile, that we have little opportunities to do that. But this is a sample that is quite small, so it wouldn't be that hard either, no?
It would be wonderful, and from that perspective, it's actually it's really good that you ended up not recruiting as many of the older children. So most of your children are between 4 and 6, and that's better methodologically, because now, you know, it's a narrower age range, and now you can follow them up longitudinally. And just in terms of what you were saying about an obligation, it's similar to my student Tia Neha, who's Maori and who collected the Maori data. She didn't tell me at the time, but she told me later that, and she knew going into it, that when she started working with these families, she actually had an obligation to follow them for the rest of her life, basically. I did not realize what I was asking her to do. She's like, that's okay. I knew what I was getting into. And she's still following those families.
Thank you, Elaine. And Dolores?
Hi, everyone. Very nice talks. I enjoyed them very much. It triggered all the time my own narratives and how sometimes we're not even aware of them. And this question is for you, Elaine. I'm very interested in child sexual abuse victims. Mm-hmm. And I was finding your intervention so interesting as a prevention tool, since narratives are so important in the mental health outcomes for these people. So I don't know if this has been done yet or if you thought about it. I was also thinking how important these tools are, especially for taboos in society, such as maybe Javiera, your topics, infertility and not being able to conceive, using donors, which are things we don't usually yet talk about freely. And child sexual abuse is also a taboo yet.
It's such an important topic, and I'm not a clinical psychologist, so I would defer to my clinical colleagues like Karen Salmon, and Robyn. Of course, you've written so much on silence, silencing these really traumatic and horrible stories and what that can do to children. But I just think that would need to be done very, very carefully with through a therapeutic. It would have to be done therapeutically. So I do think our typical elaborative reminiscing interventions work really well for these sort of everyday negative experiences. But I don't think we can generalize from our data that it would work for more traumatic or taboo events in the family. Robyn, you've written about this quite a lot.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think this is one of the things that makes Javiera's research so fabulously interesting, is that these are taboo topics. And you know, Elaine and I actually wrote a paper on family secrets. So we're not around these kinds of really, really taboo things, but the idea being that, you know, how things are silenced within families, yet still known. This happens a lot in alcoholic families, in abusive families. And I guess this gets to the first question on trauma. The interventions that Kristen Valentino has done has been with maltreating mothers, but it's mostly neglect, some physical abuse. And the intervention is not to talk about the abuse itself, but just to reminisce about life experiences, you know, more broadly. I think I would just echo what Elaine said. I think there are, I think it would take really careful thinking by really about if and how creating elaborated narratives of these more horribly traumatic experiences would in fact be healing. And I think there's mixed evidence of that kind of in the adult literature.
Thank you very much, both of you.
And
well,
we
are. Sorry, Elaine, go ahead.
I was just going to add one thing to that. That I think the Maori adolescent narratives speak to that issue. That I have a feeling that, well, just going through those narratives, some of those events were traumatic events for the parents. Some of the narratives were not coherent at all, very difficult to follow. And And so that was something that happened to their parents. But then if you internalize that, it's something, that happened in your family. So it just needs to be done very, very carefully in terms of an intervention protocol.
Thank you, Elaine. Well, we are on time, but we can have a few more words. Carolina and Sebastian.
Yeah, I want to pick up on what Elaine just said. That made me think also about the adult attachment interview, which is also tries to, there's evidence that the people with insecure attachment tend to have more disorganized attachment, tend to have more incoherent narratives of their own childhood and like one side perspective, not being able to put themselves in their parents or their own perspective. It makes a lot of sense in that way, and how having how do you say that this very elaborative narrative also implies that you can make a meaning to your experience, and that meaning is in itself can be more healing. I made that link. I don't know, what do you think about that?
I don't know. Elaine, go ahead.
Oh no, I'm sorry. I agree. I agree that attachment that's definitely part of the picture, and would be very interesting to look into, both when their adolescents are talking about their parents' experiences and also their own experiences.
Thank you. Sebastian?
Yes. I don't know if you can hear me. I'm not sure. Yes, great. Now, I was thinking, thank you first for the talks. Thank you, Javier. I'm really proud. So I was thinking, I work with young adults, with non-heterosexual people, and I've been finding something that it really struck me, that I have people who describe their parents in their narratives as very violent against like gender non-conforming people. And all these people at the time of the study presented like more symptoms, let's say. I'm not using like statistic measures to analyze that. And I have only one person who described these parents as very supportive of like non-conforming play, etc., etc. And this person didn't present many like mental health symptoms at the time of the study. So I've been thinking, because I can't know what really happened in the past, that's a thing that I can't know, but I have a lot of literature, like other studies, who tell me that parents do treat violently kids, like non-conforming kids. So I've been thinking, like, how this kind of like gender, non-conforming gender, sexuality also play a role in the ways in which like young adults then like present these characters, and how these also relate to their emotional like regulation strategies. I don't know, I'm just like throwing some ideas into the space based on my own findings, and how also parents, because I wasn't thinking about parents at the beginning of my study, but how parents became really, really important in these narratives of young adults, let's say, like supportive or non-supportive parents as characters, of course, because I can't know if they were or were not really that. So yes, thank you.
I don't know if someone wants to comment on that.
There's some really interesting work on narratives of gender nonconforming youth by Phil Hammack, but he looks at their narratives and kind of how they came to understand their own sexuality. They don't always talk about their parents, but some do. Lisa Diamond has done some really interesting narrative work um, with women who identify as lesbian. Again, looking at their narratives, she's done some really lovely longitudinal work. Again, talking, narratives about their discovery of their sexuality, their understanding, how it changes over time. And again, I think Phil has more evidence that parents play a role because he works with younger adolescents. But I don't think anybody's directly addressed that. It's a really interesting question.
Yeah, and it was really new, and also really new for me to see that, like, at least how they describe them, like supportive parents, like the guy who has like supportive parents presented less like mental health problems at the time of the study. I don't know. I don't have an answer, but it's like a finding. So it's really interesting for me, like to think about everything you're talking about like emotional regulation, like parent support as well. So thank you.
Just maybe to add something before we finish, because we are already 10 minutes over time, but because I was thinking about the Robyn's questions to Javiera regarding the appropriateness of, what is appropriate to talk about, young children and so on, but also these like of big narratives that are presented to children, in this case, engendered narrative, right? That have, of course, enduring impact on children and people. But then, well, that's why I think that's the value of reminiscing, right? I mean, of discussing, of questioning, of elaborating, that you can dig into. I mean, you just don't have to consume a narrative, but you can think about the narrative, discover the fractures, the tensions, so you have a chance to co-construct, to discuss, to think about them. And in that sense, well, what is appropriate or not, it depends a lot of the children, of the culture, of the mother. But if you open the conversation, if you invite children to discuss, to think, to question, and so on, maybe the appropriateness is less important, right? Because you are able to I don't know, to, how do you say, to seize or to evaluate interactively the appropriate of the talk. But if you just give a narrative, yeah, of course you can give a really maybe inappropriate narrative. Maybe the non-elaborative example of Javiera regarding the, well, you don't have my seat, right? So you are not like me, right? Is a good example of that. I mean, there is no discussion, and that is one side of a story. And of course, it might be a wrong side or I don't know, an appropriate side. If it's just one side, you have more chance to be, I don't know if wrong, but inappropriate. So yeah, just to add that. So I don't know, it has been very, very interesting. Thank you so much, Robyn and Elaine, for joining us today. Thank you, Javiera, for presenting your results. Javiera has many, many other results. I mean, her research is so big, so she's digging into her data. So probably we will invite you again to listen to her wonderful results. Thank you, Marie-Cécile and Marcela and everybody to join us today. We hope to continue this discussion and this conversation that has so many, I don't know, entanglements. So thank you again, and hope to see you soon. I don't know, Javiera, if you want to say something.
Well, just add the thank you. I'm going to go to bed tonight very happy. So and that's thank you to you. So thanks for hearing.
And thank you for inviting me. This was fabulous, so interesting. I'm going to echo what Elaine said. I always learn I always learn something amazing when I listen to Elaine, and now I have somebody else to add to that list. Javiera, thank you. I learned a lot, and really, really appreciate your perspective very much.
Great. Well, let's hope this is the beginning of more new learnings.
A continuing conversation. Muchas
Yes.
gracias.
Yeah. Hope to see you in Chile in person.
I hope so.
Yes.
Okay, so thank you